Department of Homeland Security.
Hello, is this Joydeep speaking?
Yes, it is.
I am stunned. We are actually talking, for the listeners. We have had a riotous series of events. Your phone line has gone down. My Wi-Fi has gone down. We're finally chatting. How are you?
Very good, thank you. I mean, the summer is firmly behind me. And, I have two modes of operations, stop and go, and right now it's all go.
Yeah, because you're busily working on the next book, eh?
Yep.
Well,
I need to get that in, actually, by the end of the month, so...
Oh, gracious. But yeah. Well, so let's tell the listeners about the book that is already on the shelf. The watch. What would you like them to know about it?
Are we live? Are we starting?
We are.
Okay. Well, the watch was originally called Antigone in Kandahar. That was the working title, which should cue your listeners into the fact that this is a retelling of Sophocles' Antigone set in contemporary Kandahar in an American combat base in the remote northern port of Kandahar province. And in the aftermath of a battle with locals, a young girl turns up and asks for the return of her brother's body in order to bury him. And the Americans refuse, and that leads to a standoff that lasts for 2 days and is eventually ended in a mode fitting with the original Sophocles version. So it's a book that, unlike most novels or non-fiction accounts published about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or indeed about the West's confrontation with the Muslim world, actually goes to great lengths to tell their side of the story in a manner that balances against the Western side. I don't take sides. In fact, I remove myself from the novel altogether, and there are 7 chapters told in 7 voices, 2 Afghan and 5 American, and they each have their take on the particular event that anchors the story, which is the girl. And for me, it's a nice microcosm of the larger war and the cultural misunderstandings that lead to things like green on blue incidents.
You mentioned misunderstandings. What do you think that, or 2 or 3 things? What do you think that the average American does not know about Afghanistan and needs to know about it?
The first thing that the average American does not know is that Afghanistan is a remarkably ethnically diverse country. The insurgency, such as it is fueled by the largest ethnic group. These are the Pashtuns, who live in the southern part of the province. They also supply the majority of foot soldiers for the Taliban, although the Pashtuns and the Taliban are not synonymous. There are non-Pashtun non-Taliban Pashtun as well. So they're in the ethnic majority, and they used to be in the clear majority, but over the last 20 years, many of them have become refugees from the war in neighboring Pakistan. Now, the Pashtuns are spread across the border, which was, as in most cases under the British Empire, a random line drawn through Pashtun tribal territories in the late 1800s. That's known as the Durand Line, after the gentleman who plotted the separation. And the Pashtuns do not recognize this line. They easily cross the border on both sides. The northern part of Afghanistan comprises of the Hazaras, who are Shia Muslims. the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Turkmen. Now, these are all minority populations, and the Hazaras are the only Shia ethnic group in Afghanistan. Everyone else is Sunni, but by virtue of being in the minority, they formed what was known as the Northern Alliance that fought the Taliban in the 1990s and now provides the bulk of support for the American and NATO presence there. Most of the groups in the Northern Alliance speak Dari, which is an offshoot of Persian. The Pashtuns speak Pashto, which is also an offshoot of Persian linguistically, but a different offshoot. So in addition to the different ethnic and linguistic groups, there are also, different tribes that constantly form alliances against each other. My closest Western analogy would be the condition of Germany during the 30 Years' War, or the circumstances in Greece during the Peloponnesian War, where it's basically war of all against all. So that's the first thing American readers, not just American readers, Canadian readers, in general readers in the West, need to know, that there are linguistic, ethnic, and religious divisions among the Afghans. The second thing they need to know is, historically, Afghanistan has been a country that's been easily conquered, but very difficult to keep under submission. Now, that might seem like an anachronism, a contradiction in terms as well. But from Alexander onwards, invaders with organized, formal armies have found it easy to march into Afghanistan, but the Afghan natives are excellent guerrilla fighters. And they exhausted the Soviets in the 1980s, and now they have basically exhausted the Westerners by their constant keeping ahead of the kind of technologies that outside invaders can bring into play. The latest, of course, being the IEDs, which have confined Western and NATO troops to their bases. And now, of course, kind of green and blue fighting, wherein soldiers trained by the West are now turning their guns on their trainers and making the bases themselves quite uninhabitable. So that's the second thing you need to know. I mean, here's a country, a people that do not take kindly to occupation, and then again, what country does? The third thing that the American readers need to know is that Afghans have traditionally not been Islamic fundamentalists. This was an importation by the Saudi Arabians in the 1980s with, ironically, American help channeled through the Pakistanis. So this is a case of blowback where the allies of the 1980s have fallen out with each other. They have traditionally followed Sufi Islam, which in contemporary terms would be a very sort of mystical, New Agey kind of Islam, with many incorporations from pre-Islamic religions like Buddhism and the Attic religions that were brought by the invading Greeks, both under Alexander and before Alexander. So this religious identity is very much a part and parcel of the famous Afghan hospitality, whereby they are ethically bound to certain codes of conduct that they call, in the case of the Pashtuns, Pashtunwali, whereby they swear by these codes of, the equivalent of 10 Commandments that are actually, in many cases, much stronger than any kind of fundamentalist Islamic importation. So there you go. I mean, here's a snapshot of a country that is remarkably diverse and, of course, topographically spectacular in its variation in a rather small territory, the size of, well, actually three-quarters the size of the American state of Texas. Mm-hmm. A topography that varies from the southern deserts in Helmand and Kandahar to some of the tallest mountains in the world, the Hindu Kush and the Palmer Knot, which essentially give birth to the Himalayas that then sprawl eastwards, dividing India and Tibet. A very, very starkly beautiful land with tremendous variations in climate, from winters that last 8 months of the year to summers that can desiccate the skin if you stay outside for more than 3 hours. Ferocious sandstorms of the like that feature in my novel, The Watch, and a people that have, on the face of it, turned their back on quote-unquote modernity and seem quite content to lead the kind of life they have always led, which is predominantly agrarian and predominantly pastoral.
Yeah, and part
okay?
of it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fine. One thing I really loved about the Watch, and you've alluded to it already, is that you're not judgmental on it, and neither are the various U.S. troops who narrate chapter by chapter. To the degree that they think it through as to why they're there, and the general PR on the Afghan war is that, and I'll put this in very simplistic terms, is that it's almost a war for women's rights, for Western standards of liberal democracy to be put in there. To what degree does the West have any right to impose its standards of civilization on another nation?
Well, the story is a little more complicated than that, because prior to 1979, which was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and all the problems started, for almost 50 years, from the 1930s onwards, Afghanistan was under the rule of one king. I mean, it's very difficult to believe in the present context. He was more or less a figurehead, but precisely the kind of figurehead I think a country like that needs. This was Zahir Shah, sort of ruled as a benign, Queen Elizabeth type monarch, and presided over their native form of parliament, which is the Loya Jirga, or the tribal parliament, wherein disputes were resolved between tribal chiefs and tribal representatives. Now, as much as this sounds, like something out of the Magna Carta, at the same time, the Afghan cities, particularly Kabul, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, saw a pretty high degree of westernization. In fact, if one looks at photographs in the 1960s and 1970s of the Kabul University campus, you see women who would not be out of place in Canada or the United States. Now, what's happened since is, of course, in the 1980s, the Soviets imposed a very radical policy of egalitarianism that contravened the tribal codes of conduct, and the backlash against that was precisely the kind of fundamentalism imported by the Saudis. Against that background, what has been going on over the last 20 years in terms of the position of women especially is horrific. One of my personal sources of information about Afghanistan is an organization called the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, who were originally based in Peshawar until their leader was killed by Muslim fundamentalists and are now based in Quetta and Karachi. This is an organization entirely run by women who are proposing a kind of amalgamation of Western democracy, if you will, with the kind of tribal roots that have always been part and parcel of this country. In other words, a kind of throwback to what was the nature of the polity in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, what we have today is a very artificial situation because the traditional tribal structures as a result of the bloodletting of the last 30 years have fundamentally broken down and have been replaced by a cadre, if you like in Marxist terms, the revolutionary vanguard of Islamic fundamentalists trained in madrasas, religious schools in Pakistan, with the connivance of the authorities there. These madrasas are peopled by the orphans from 30 years of bloodletting in Afghanistan, and as one observer has very astutely remarked, we are faced with a generation of young men who are fighting against the foreign occupation in Afghanistan, who've essentially had no experience of normal family life, but more critically have had no experience of a normal family life that includes maternal figures, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and so forth.
Yep.
Their ideas of womanhood are very, very skewed, and in fact, a bastardization of what is in both the Quran and the Hadiths, the Islamic religious books, and much more closely reflect the kind of skewed fundamentalism that is practiced in Saudi Arabia, which is, if I'm not mistaken, still the only Muslim country which bars women, for instance, from driving cars.
Yes.
So this is an imputation. And the need of the day is for the West to engage with moderates. Now, that is in theory, of course, because one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years is the urban intelligentsia in Afghanistan have either fled, they are in exile, and the new generations have no experience of their home country, or they've been killed. I mean, a staggering statistic that I picked up some time ago was that 50% of the intellectuals of 1970s era Afghanistan were killed in the 1980s and 1990s. So we have a country where literally you're going to have to educate people not only into Western conceptions of democracy, but also into their own native traditions, such as the Loya Jirga. We've seen increasingly how this very radical fundamentalist younger generation have very little patience with traditional tribal structures and resort remarkably quickly to black and white measures like assassination of more moderate leaders in the villages and so forth.
Yeah.
So what does the West need to do? I mean, the story of the American occupation over the last 12 years has been a story of fundamental breakdown of administration, the support of a horrendously corrupt regime which has not only delegitimized the Western occupation in the eyes of common Afghans, but has delegitimized the principle of Western democracy altogether. That accompanied by very, very ham-handed tactics in terms of negotiations. Really, I mean, the best we can hope is for there to be some sort of settling down and calming down following the Western pullout in 2014, but I doubt that's going to happen. I foresee just the kind of bloodletting, an absolute bloodbath of the kind that followed the Soviet exit. I wish I could be more optimistic, but we're very far from the sort of Afghanistan which in the 1950s, for instance, produced someone like the Frontier Gandhi, as he was called, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was a Pashtun leader who was a follower of Gandhi and persuaded the very martial Pashtuns to lay down their guns and settle disputes by peaceful means. Once again, a leader like that in the contemporary picture would probably be dead overnight.
Sadly, yeah, you're almost undoubtedly right. I want to lead us now into a topic that I know that you have very strong opinions about. There are all kinds of things in the world that you could write about as a novelist. You've chosen to write about this, and I don't know how much you want to discuss now about the trilogy that you're working on. The role of the fiction writer, and in terms of tackling these very hard news topics. Why did you choose to write about the Afghan war and these kind of generally non-commercial areas?
Right. One of the things that's appalled me is that if you read contemporary fiction, you would not know that we live in a state of war. In fact, you wouldn't know that we live in a continuous state of war. We've lived in a continuous state of war since the ostensible closure of the last Great War in 1945. But we have. Our world today, in a very fundamental way, is defined by these never-ending clashes between one segment of the world in the present time, the Islamic world, and another segment of the world, which is the West. Look at today's headlines: the American ambassador in Libya assassinated. Now, I believe that fiction has a very strong place in communicating to the average citizen the state of the world. This is what was done by the titans of the 19th century, by Dickens, who brought about fundamental changes in child labor laws in England that then were adopted all over the rest of the world, by Tolstoy, by Dostoevsky, by people like that. But if you look at the post-1945 scenario, creative writing has become essentially entertainment. And it's not just entertainment, it's very solipsistic entertainment, where the fiction writer seems capable of writing only about his or her very narrow reality, at best writing about the community that surrounds them, mostly middle class, mostly middle brow, mostly determined by that person's occupation, either as a city dweller or in academia and so forth, and in sort of blitheful oblivion to the larger reality. Now, I come from India. I come from a country that was, until very recently, a part of the British Empire. The weight of that 200-year-old cross weighs quite heavily on our shoulders, as much as contemporary India appears to have embraced the neoliberal globalism paradigm. I live in a world where I am faced every day with the deaths of people who look like me for reasons that, on the face of it, are almost inevitably resource-related. The resource in this case being petroleum, minerals, so forth. And it's very distressing to see how parochial writers in the West can be, not just in the rare pronouncements they make about non-Western cultures, and I'm thinking about people like Ian McEwan or Martin Amis and their horrendously ignorant comments about Islam, but also in terms of their attitudes. In many ways, we are in a situation of two cultures when it comes to creative writing, where you have white writers writing for white audiences, and you have non-white writers writing about their milieu, but in a way catering to the stereotypes of the Western audience. And it horrifies me. And I think the least I can do as a writer, coming from where I am and with my training in political science and philosophy, is precisely to humanize the horrendous statistics that we're faced with every day. You know, these drone attacks and the casualties of these wars, and the attitudes that are perpetuated. And it sort of leads me to sort of use the instruments at my command, which is a creative imagination, to not only write a cycle of novels that will illuminate the massive legacy of medieval Islam on which Western civilization today rests, but also the horrendous costs on both sides. In terms of the actual bloodletting that is perpetuated by wars that seem to be the fallback position of American foreign policy. And I can do it creatively precisely by writing books about characters that spring out of the page and walk into your room and make you understand that at the end of the day, there are certain universal standards of family, of community, that transcend national and political barriers and demand to be heard. And I'm merely giving voice to that.
Agreed, and phrased beautifully. By the way, I'm going to be interviewing Amos in a couple of weeks, and I'm curious, what the hell did Martin say?
I think it was 5 or 6 years ago when he made a comment. You know, there was a time when every Martin Amis book in England was preceded by Martin Amis making a very sort of inflammatory statement, not necessarily about Muslims, but about women and so forth, about older generations who needed to be euthanized because they were taking up too much of the national expenditure and so forth. I mean, basically a way of drawing attention to himself and being very faithfully lapped up by the British press, which I think is extremely substandard. In terms of Islam, I think, and don't quote me on this, from what I remember, he made a comment about their standards of hygiene not being up to British standards. Now, of course, this is an England which hasn't really progressed in many ways from the England that Dickens described, especially in terms of cities like, I'm talking about cities outside of London where there's rampant poverty and breakdown of communities as a result of Thatcherite policies. McEwan then went ahead and said the same thing in Italy in a news conference, once again a very derogatory reference to Islam, which kind of, is in keeping with the sort of sentiment, and I forget who voiced this, but it was someone relatively, quote-unquote, educated in America, where faced with, the question of why non-Western literature is not better represented in academia, said, well, where's the equivalent of the Iliad? Now, something like that can only come out of very, very gross ignorance, because if you really were to sit down with that person, I could produce, a dozen epics that surpass the Iliad, not only in scope but in richness, and not just from the Muslim world. So, of course, Amos and McEwan then have since, and along with their very good late friend, Christopher Hitchens, who once again was a darling of the sort of, cocktail circuit in New York, Washington, D.C., and London, always propped up their arguments by pointing to what was done to Salman Rushdie, which, once again, is sort of like identifying the tree and ignoring the forest, in that what was done to Rushdie is not symptomatic and not characteristic of the religion as a whole. Right. But it's very, very interesting that these are the figures that keep being brought up and, in a sense, propped up by the literary establishment. I mean, I think the worst case scenario here is V.S. Naipaul, whose career over 30 years was, I think, most appropriately summed up by Edward Said, who said that here's a guy from the periphery whose career has been all about embracing the center and being more white than the whites. Lately, I believe he's been given to being partial to Hindu fundamentalism, and why be surprised by that? But once again, interestingly, these are the people who are given the limelight, who are brought forward as, the proper representatives of erudition, and it's to our loss. It's to the loss of what should be a larger enterprise of enlightenment.
When you mentioned Naipaul, when I read The Mask of Africa, I thought, this is a completely racist book. These ignorant Africans, and running around and killing one another, and the most sympathy was for the animals killed. And I was thinking, now what the hell are you writing?
Exactly, and these are the pronouncements, such as they are, that are then faithfully reproduced by the Western press and lauded as being, characteristically forthright. What can one say? I mean, he's done the same thing in terms of the books he wrote on India. He did the same thing in terms of the books he wrote about the Muslim world, among the believers being, a case in point. So he's made a career of precisely the kind of things that most whites would hesitate to say in public, and therefore laud the fact that here is this specimen from the Caribbean, who seems to have no compunction about saying things like this.
Yeah, and he's a magnificent writer. I mean, he writes beautifully, but I think that, why are you writing from this standpoint? Why are you pandering to the ignorant? You know?
Well, beautiful writing never really went hand in hand with ethical beauty. I mean, take the case of Celine, take the case of so many writers who have had very questionable political associations. Noah Thompson, there you are.
Yeah.
And this is the guy who gets the Nobel, right? I mean, what can you say?
Well, it's awards. Because every year, as somebody drives past my window with a lawnmower, how very handy. But the books that I truly love rarely end up on Booker shortlists or Giller shortlists or whatever. So what drives you? Why do you swim against the current?
Well, someone has to give a voice to the voiceless, right?
Yeah.
And it's as I have discovered writing The Watch, the voiceless are on both sides. I've been thanked by American officers who have served in Afghanistan for actually noticing that. Now, The Watch is written from a standpoint of impartiality. I have essentially let the characters have full autonomy and let them tell their tale. Interestingly, this was interpreted in Britain as a missed opportunity, as if reality is completely black and white, and in George W. Bush terms, you're either with us or against us. By, the sort of weak-kneed left-wing intellectuals that populate the establishment in both America and Europe, and of course England, who will pay paper sentiments to their opposition, but are never found when there is actual need for action, the kind of thing that drove the short-lived occupation movement last year, very short-lived because it didn't get the kind of push it should have gotten from the intellectual class. What drives me is precisely, this is what I do for a living. This is my weapon. And it's much more effective in terms of reaching a greater audience than descending into the street for that completely aimless march against the next war. Although I have to say, going down into the street can be enormously effective if it is more than simply a daily action, as we've seen from the events in that formed the so-called Arab Spring, but also what's been going on with the students in Quebec and their refusal to give way to, quote-unquote, wiser heads. So my writing is my drawing a line in the sand. It's my position. I'm staking a position here. And it's not just one book, and it explains why I am feeling driven to end a book and begin another, because this is the way you build an audience. This is the way you educate, and to a certain extent, these are novels, but in the classic 19th century sense, they are didactic, without being didactic, without being preachy, essentially inviting the Western reader to step into the non-Western world and think in the privacy of their own rooms, in the privacy of their own heads and hearts, where their leaders have been leading them amiss. Because we can't go on like this. We can't go on with these endless wars, this endless sacrifice of manpower and material. Our world is certainly in a crisis, and we've all got to make our voices heard, as much as my writing as yours.
And on that note, unfortunately, the time for this podcast is drawing short now. So, because I want the audience to hear this, I interview authors every week, and and have been doing that for years. You're one of the few that I truly admire as a human being and as a writer, and you're one of the very, very, very few that I call a friend. You are a wonderful person.
Thank you, Hubert. And you'll be getting that op-ed soon, I promise. And I think that's mutual. The sentiment is entirely mutual. You are providing here an avenue for writers like me to be heard that is rare and is very, very necessary.
We try, and you and I shall just chat, not like for the tape and so forth soon. So
Absolutely.
Okay, and I truly look forward to the next book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, my friend.
Bye-bye, my
Bye-bye.
friend. Ta.